The smell hits you first. Not perfume or roasted meat or the waxy scent of a polished throne room, but something sour, something heavy. A reek like old blood wrapped in silk. Behind the velvet curtains of Whitehall Palace, the most powerful man in England is rotting alive, and no one dares to say it out loud. Henry VIII, king, lion, once the golden boy of Christendom, now wheezes from a bed too narrow for his girth, bloated and bandaged, more boil than man. And he's not dead yet. Not quite. Let's rewind just a little. Henry wasn't always a horror show. In his 20s, he was dazzling, tall, athletic, charming. He played tennis, hunted with ruthless flair, and could charm a court full of diplomats with a flick of his auburn locks. But somewhere between beheading wives and breaking from the Pope, things began to shift. A jousting accident in 1536 is where the rot arguably begins, quite literally. He was knocked from his horse, massive, armored, brutal, and the horse landed on him. Henry was unconscious for 2 hours. Something shifted in his brain after that. Maybe something cracked. He was never quite the same. After that fall, a leg wound refused to heal. Sounds minor. It wasn't. It festered. It reopened. It stank. The royal physicians, bless their medieval optimism, stuffed it with everything from herbs to powdered gold, but all they managed to do was trap the infection in place. Imagine an open sore that gapes and oozes for years. Henry had 2. The ulcers on his legs became infamous, so rank that courtiers reportedly gagged when he passed. No one was allowed to speak of them, of course. He was the king, after all. But even his tailors had to adjust his wardrobe around the constant draining. This was not just a hygiene problem. The ulcers weren't cosmetic. They were agonizing. His legs swelled grotesquely. He could barely walk. Toward the end, he had to be hoisted by pulleys onto his own horse, like meat on a hook. Every step likely felt like fire. His once muscled frame swelled with weight and rage. Some estimates put him at over 400 pounds by his final years, an enormous, immobile man with a festering lower half and an unrelenting temper. And oh, the temper. Henry VIII was always headstrong, but pain, isolation, and paranoia sharpened him to a razor's edge. People disappeared. Wives, advisors, allies. No one was safe. He turned on friends like spoiled milk. Execution became a solution for everything. Inconvenient marriages, political rivals, whispers of treason. The Tower of London worked overtime. And all the while, beneath the royal robes, the king's own body was quietly betraying him. Food, you ask? He didn't stop, not even close. Despite the ulcers, despite the obesity, Henry feasted. It was said he consumed up to 5,000 calories a day. Venison, pies, rich cheeses, mountains of bread, endless wine. A man with an oozing leg wound gorging on Boar's Head. Imagine the banquet table, the strained seats, the servants trying not to breathe. There's something unsettling about the contrast. Publicly, he was still portrayed as vigorous, righteous, divinely appointed. But behind closed doors, his bed linens had to be changed constantly from the mess his legs made. His mobility was so poor that the royal apartments had to be modified, widened doorways, reinforced chairs, and shorter distances between rooms. He stank. He groaned. He sweated. His skin turned blotchy and pallid. And he feared death. Oh, how he feared death. This was a man obsessed with legacy. He broke England from Rome for a son. He killed 2 wives for sons. He dissolved monasteries for gold and glory. And still, in the quiet moments between pain and prayer, the doubt crept in. Was God punishing him? Was his festering body a divine sign? He summoned scholars and priests to justify his every move, all while his flesh pulsed with infection, and the ulcers kept leaking. Some say Henry developed what we might now call diabetes. Certainly the symptoms were there. Rapid weight gain, cognitive shifts, ulcers, fatigue. Others point to Cushing's syndrome or chronic venous insufficiency. But whatever label we use, the reality remains. He was decaying by inches, a monarch eaten from the inside out. By the early 1540s, his paranoia had a permanent seat at court. He distrusted nearly everyone. He would alternate between sudden bursts of affection and terrifying rages. His speech slurred. His memory faltered. He accused his own wives, Catherine Howard and later Catherine Parr, of betrayal. His once formidable intellect, which had written treatises against Martin Luther, was now too clouded to govern. He delegated more and more while brooding in bed, a flesh prison of his own making. The irony is Shakespearean. A man who once rode into tournaments gleaming in armor, cheered by crowds, now lay trapped in linen, stinking of pus and regret. And yet, he kept the illusion alive. Royal artists still painted him as godlike. His courtiers bowed lower. The illusion of majesty endured. But beneath it, a gruesome truth grew louder. One chronicler wrote that approaching Henry's rooms was like entering a tomb. The air was close, warm, and unnatural. Candles burned constantly to mask the odor. He had moments of lucidity, sure, but they were becoming rare. Mostly he grumbled, barked, accused, and the ulcers, ever faithful, never closed. This isn't just a sad end to a complex man. It's a slow-burn horror story. A body that becomes a prison. A king who becomes a monster to those around him. A legacy melting under the weight of flesh and fever. And we're only just getting started. The smell never really left. That sickly sweet rot lingered even when Henry VIII wasn't in the room, embedded in cushions, soaked into wood, haunting tapestries. Servants whispered of it like a ghost. And yet, day after day, the King of England endured, or perhaps more accurately, persisted. What remained of him was less man and more monument, a grotesque symbol of unchecked power collapsing from within. By the mid-1540s, Henry had become something you approached carefully, like a sleeping bear with open sores. His body was no longer just in decline. It was mutinous. Gout gripped his joints with vice-like pain. His feet and hands swelled. His once proud posture was now a slump of flesh in embroidered robes. But worse, far worse, was the progression of his ulcers. The open wounds on his legs had become cavernous. Flies buzzed near him even in winter. Physicians attempted increasingly desperate treatments, cauterization, poultices made of everything from moss to pig fat, and one memorable concoction that involved honey, resin, and wine. Sounds poetic, doesn't it? It wasn't. It was sticky, stinking torture. And Henry, full of wrath and discomfort, directed his frustration at anyone within reach. Courtiers learned the choreography of survival, how to flatter without triggering rage, how to breathe shallowly in his presence, how to nod solemnly when he accused yet another servant of treason for forgetting a towel or looking at him too long. This was not just a sick man. This was a living, weaponized corpse with a crown and a tendency to order beheadings before breakfast. And yet, there were brief flickers of clarity, moments when the Henry of old surfaced. He still wrote. He still ordered reforms. But even those flashes were clouded with the venom of suspicion. In 1546, he had his longtime advisor Thomas Wriothesley tortured for speaking out of turn. His final wife, Catherine Parr, had to dance a delicate waltz of intelligence and submission, knowing full well that her cleverness might one day be seen as sedition. One poorly phrased sentence and it would be her neck on the block. Henry's weight ballooned further. He could no longer climb stairs. His bedroom became his throne room, his council chamber, his prison. Visitors were summoned to his bedside. They entered bowing, exited relieved. Some wrote that his mood would swing wildly, giggling one moment, shouting for executions the next. And throughout, he oozed. He leaked. He smelled of meat gone bad. At this stage, Henry's body was betraying him not just physically, but psychologically. Pain changes people, especially the kind that never ends. Imagine every movement feeling like shards in the joints. Imagine knowing your own stench precedes you. Imagine the horror of knowing your courtiers are smiling through nausea. And worst of all, knowing that they're waiting for you to die. So Henry clung to power with desperate fists. He micromanaged from bed. He issued contradictory orders. He signed death warrants with shaking hands. And still, he ate. Still, he drank. Somewhere beneath the infected tissue was the memory of a king who had once commanded armies, but now he could barely command his own bowels. His doctors, such as they were, had run out of ideas. Some quietly began to pray. Others tried bloodletting again, because medieval medicine often resembled a particularly cruel game of guess and bleed. His ulcers had begun to tunnel, what modern medicine calls sinus tracts, where infection burrows deeper into flesh. These weren't just surface wounds, they were pockets of rot, threatening sepsis at any moment. Every day he didn't die was a surprise. And still, he wouldn't go. That's what made it worse in a way. There's a unique horror to watching someone clearly dying, who just won't. He lingered month after month, refusing to release his grip on a kingdom that had already begun preparing for a future without him. His will was updated. His son Edward's regency council was formed. Even his palaces were being readied for the mourning ceremonies. But Henry just sat there, wheezing, leaking, living. He had long since stopped confiding in most people. Even his food tasters were changed frequently, lest they develop a taste for rebellion. Rumors swirled that he feared poisoning, perhaps from enemies or perhaps from karma itself. He forbade certain foods, then demanded them. He accused a stable boy of witchcraft because a horse stumbled. When a bishop coughed near him, he screamed that it was an omen. Everything became a sign, a message, a threat. In his final winter, the room was kept stiflingly warm, an attempt to ease the pain in his limbs. But heat only amplified the stink. One ambassador, after visiting the king's apartments, reportedly burned his clothes afterward. The courtiers grew pale, the servants thinner. The palace itself felt cursed, like a fever dream of velvet and sweat. And yet nobody dared speak of his death. To say the king was dying was treason. To whisper that the king might soon die was a gamble. You were either a prophet or a corpse. And Henry? Henry maintained the performance of rule even as his body collapsed. It was surreal. A bloated, ulcerated monarch surrounded by tapestries of saints and trumpets, issuing edicts with a trembling hand as if the world couldn't see the flies. There's something undeniably tragic about it. Not just because Henry had become unrecognizable, but because he seemed to know it. The mirrors were removed from his chambers, allegedly. The portraits were altered to show a towering warrior. And when he did speak of death, it was coded. Talk of legacy, of eternal soul, of God's judgment. He wanted to be remembered as the great king, defender of the faith, father of the navy, architect of English might. But the truth was leaking into the floorboards. In these last years, Henry became a national ghost before he even died. His once constant public appearances vanished. The parades stopped. The jousts, of course, had long been canceled. He existed as a myth, kept alive through rumor and portrait, while the real man, flesh and fever, stayed hidden in suffocating rooms. Eventually, even he began to sense it was near. He started asking about the end. In fits of clarity, he would speak to his priests, voice trembling. He requested prayers. He asked after his son Edward. He made confessions. And while no one dared say the words outright, they all felt it. The king, the lion, the god on earth, was finally unraveling. But death had one more performance planned. And it wasn't going to be graceful. Death, when it came for Henry VIII, did not do so quietly. It arrived with all the subtlety of a dropped chandelier, dragging a trail of disease, bloat, and royal denial behind it. In the early days of January 1547, Henry lay in his bed at Whitehall, the sheets beneath him damp, dark, and permanently stained by what leaked from his decaying legs. His breathing was labored, his speech reduced to a rasp, and his mind flickered in and out of coherence like a candle nearly spent. Yet still, the charade endured. The courtiers continued to bow. The doctors continued to murmur about fevers and imbalance instead of what it really was, a once mighty king whose body had been marinating in infection for years. No one dared say the words, "He is dying." To say it would be to confess treason, To admit that God's anointed monarch was failing would be to tempt the axe. So they waited, silently, and so did Henry. Bloated, bedridden, and barely human. His final days were a slow, grotesque march. He refused most food. What little he did eat barely stayed down. His bloated abdomen made lying flat impossible, so he slept upright, propped by cushions, wheezing between prayers. His skin had taken on a grayish-yellow hue. The smell was no longer containable. Not even the beeswax candles and herbs, lavender, rosemary, bay, could mask it. The king was decomposing while still technically alive. On January 27, 1547, Henry gave his last confession. Barely able to speak, he reportedly whispered his sins to Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. When asked if he trusted in Christ's mercy, Henry squeezed his hand. That was his last gesture. He died shortly after, at 55 years old. And you'd think the horror story ends there, but oh no. Henry VIII had one last grisly surprise to leave behind, because even in death, his body defied dignity. Royal protocol demanded that his corpse be sealed in a lead-lined coffin and paraded across the country to Windsor for burial next to Jane Seymour, his favorite wife, the one who had finally given him the son he so desperately wanted. But transporting the enormous ulcer-ridden corpse of a 400-pound man in midwinter? Let's just say nature had other plans. The journey began slowly, too slowly. The coffin, massive and weighted with lead, was hoisted onto a carriage. It creaked under the burden. Guards accompanied the cortege, as did clergy, noblemen, and a carefully rehearsed sense of grandeur. The public saw a procession. But beneath the velvet drapery and the gilded wheels, something was happening inside that coffin. Henry's body was decomposing rapidly. The pressure inside his abdomen began to build. The ulcers and intestinal decay, trapped in a sealed environment, produced gas. Lots of it. And when the cortege paused overnight at Sion Abbey, something horrific occurred. By morning, witnesses claimed that the coffin had burst. Not exploded in the cinematic sense, but leaked, ruptured. The king's bloated corpse had released fluids through the seams of the coffin. A dark, oozing liquid pooled onto the floor. The stench was beyond description. One account claimed dogs were found licking at the seepage. Whether literal or metaphor, the image stuck, and it haunted English history like a curse. Even in death, Henry could not contain the rot. And then there was the burial itself. The tomb at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle had not yet been completed. Henry had planned for a glorious, elaborate monument, tall spires, golden angels, a choir of perpetual singers. But after his death, funding dried up. The vision faded. And so, the most powerful king in English history was interred in a plain vault beneath the floor, beside Jane Seymour, yes, but with no fanfare, no statue, no towering legacy, just stone above and rot below. And then, nothing. The England he left behind was unsettled. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, inherited the throne, but the boy was sickly. His regency council fractured. Religious chaos followed. And Henry? He remained beneath the chapel floor, undisturbed, unsung, and slowly becoming one with the earth. There's a certain poetic cruelty to it. A man who spent decades obsessed with control over his image, his church, his wives, even his waistline, was undone not by war or assassination or scandal, but by his own body. The king who shaped a nation ended up misshapen, decomposing under stained linens and shrouded in embarrassed silence. The grandeur he built for himself was replaced by whispers, and the leaking coffin became legend. Historians have debated the truth of that moment at Sion Abbey for centuries. Did dogs really lick the king's bodily fluids from the floor? Was the coffin truly breached? Some say no. Some say exaggeration, but in a way, it doesn't matter. Because the story stuck. It became the final fitting image of a man who lived large and died larger. A swollen monarch whose appetite, ambition, and anatomy finally consumed him. Henry VIII is remembered for many things: his 6 wives, his break from the Catholic Church, the creation of the Church of England. But for those who stood near his deathbed or bore witness to the aftermath, what they remembered most wasn't his policies or power. It was the smell. It was the sound of bandages peeling from ulcers. It was the groan of a man too heavy to move and too angry to rest. It was the leaking coffin, the ruined abbey floor, and the silence that followed. He ruled with absolute authority, but his final legacy dripped through seams and stained the stone. And now we step away from that image. So take a breath. The images fade, the candlelight dims, the smell, imagined or not, is gone now. You're no longer standing in a stifling Tudor bedchamber or tracing the wheel ruts of a royal corpse dragging its decay across the countryside. You're back in the quiet of now, centuries away from the coughing, groaning king whose body turned against him. It's easy to be horrified by Henry's final chapter, the ulcers, the paranoia, the leaking coffin, but in truth, it's a mirror. A grotesque one, yes, but a reminder that no crown, no title, no divine right spares us from the slow crumble of flesh. Even the most feared man in England was, in the end, just another creature of meat and bone, undone by time. Maybe that's why we can't look away. Because horror is honest. It strips away the gold leaf and shows us the soft rot beneath. And in that mess, wretched, human, awful, there's something oddly comforting, a strange sort of justice. So when you think of Henry VIII again, and you will, don't just see the throne or the wives or the paintings where he glares like a lion in velvet. Remember the man in the bed, the one with the ulcers, the one who grunted through pain, barked through fear, and watched his legacy drip onto the stone floor of a silent abbey. And remember, history isn't always carved in marble. Sometimes it leaks. If you made it this far, first of all, you're brave. And possibly a little twisted. But we love that about you. If you enjoyed this dive into the darker corners of history, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Maybe tell us which historical horror you'd like us to unearth next. Trust me, there's plenty more where that came from. Thanks for watching, and for keeping history deliciously grim.